Sonoran Hills. Correctional facility stood as a grim concrete hulk against the Arizona desert landscape. The high walls, topped with barbed wire, cast long shadows over the rocky ground, a silent reminder that freedom ends here. The prison, built in the early 90s, was designed to hold medium-security criminals, and in its 30-odd years of existence, it had become steeped in legend and tradition. Michael Foster stopped his tattered sedan in the visitor parking lot and stood for a moment, gazing out the bleak landscape outside the window. He was 45, but the wrinkles around his eyes and the gray on his temples made him look older. 20 years as a homicide detective had left an indelible mark on his face and soul. He exhaled slowly, gathering his thoughts. Prison calls never boded well. Another suicide, Foster thought, rereading the message on his cell phone. But something about the case made the county sheriff personally call him on his day off. Michael reached for his jacket in the seat next to him, fumbled for his badge in his pocket, and got out of the car. The heat instantly became a heavy blanket over him, making him regret his choice of a dark suit. The warden, Thomas Shepard, a tall, trim man with a military bearing and a cold, appraising gaze, was waiting for him at the checkpoint. His dark blue uniform fit him impeccably, and his short haircut with graying only emphasized the image of a man accustomed to discipline and order. "Detective Foster," Shepard held out his hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. The situation is, delicate." The handshake was firm and dry. Michael immediately noted the absence of the wedding ring and the barely visible traces of it. Whether divorced or widowed, it was a habit that had become ingrained in him over the years. Foster didn't like to beat around the bush. "Your message was rather sparse." Shepard nodded to one of the guards, and they headed inside the building. The air of the prison corridor was saturated with a peculiar mixture of disinfectants, sweat, and hopelessness, a smell Michael would recognize from 1,000. Last night, at approximately 21:30, inmate Jason Warren, 35 years old, was found dead in his cell, Shepard began, as they passed through a series of heavy metal doors. "The preliminary theory is suicide, hanging with bedding." "And why did you call in a homicide detective to investigate a suicide?" Foster raised an eyebrow, scrutinizing his interlocutor's reaction. Shepard slowed his steps slightly, his face impassive, but the jowls on his cheekbones tensed subtly. "Standard procedure for all unnatural deaths in correctional facilities, especially considering the inmate's status." "What status?" Warren was serving a 7-year sentence for securities fraud, former financial advisor, educated from a wealthy family. "Not a typical resident of our walls," Shepard said smoothly, but Michael could detect a certain wariness in his tone. "His father is a powerful lawyer in Phoenix. The family's bound to ask questions. We want to make sure all procedures are followed perfectly." "Afraid of a lawsuit," Foster mentally translated, but nodded with professional courtesy. They passed a few more sections and entered the administrative wing. Here the corridors were wider, the floors were cleaner, and the bureaucratic atmosphere was slightly diluted by indoor plants in tubs and information boards. At a desk with a computer sat the warden, a sturdy middle-aged man with a square jaw and an attentive gaze. He stood up immediately at the sight of his superiors. "Ray Malone, one of our best employees," Shepard introduced him. "Ray, this is Detective Foster. He'll be investigating the Warren incident. Give him all the cooperation he needs." Malone nodded, his handshake strong but not competitive. Foster noticed the neatness in his appearance. Perfectly pressed uniform, clean-shaven face, short cropped hair. Military background, the detective decided. "Were you on duty last night?" Michael asked. "Yes, sir. I went on duty at 1800 and was supposed to be on duty until 6 this morning," Malone answered. His voice had the clear, measured intonation of a man accustomed to the chain of command. "You were the one who discovered the body?" Malone shook his head. "No, sir. The body was discovered by my colleague, Steve Harris, during his evening rounds. I was in another sector at the time, checking the cameras in B block." Foster nodded, making a mental note to talk to this Harris guy later. He noticed something strange in Malone's eyes. Not exactly anxiety, more like tension, which he tried to hide behind a professional mask. "I'd like to examine the scene and talk to anyone who had contact with the prisoner in the last 24 hours of his life," Foster said, turning to Shepard. "Of course," the warden nodded. "The cell has been sealed since the body was discovered. We've also set up a temporary morgue in the medical block. We're still holding the body, waiting for the coroner. Good. Cell phone rings. Who else on the staff had close contact with Warren? Shepard and Malone exchanged quick glances that didn't escape the attentive detective's notice. I think you should talk to Dr. Olivia Parker, our in-house psychologist, Shepard said after a brief pause. Warren was a regular attendee of the therapy sessions. Actually, he glanced at his watch. She should be in her office right now. Ray, escort Detective Foster to Dr. Parker, then show him Warren's cell and the morgue. Malone nodded and gestured for Foster to follow him. When they had moved a fair distance from the warden's office, Michael asked, "What do you think of Warren? What was he like?" The warden hesitated for a moment. Not your average prisoner. Polite, educated, never caused trouble. Had authority among the other prisoners, but not through force or intimidation. Rather, he could be helpful, give advice. A lot of people were drawn to him. Did he have any enemies? Everyone has enemies in prison, Detective, Malone said evasively. But there were no open conflicts, at least not that we've been told about. They passed through another checkpoint and found themselves in a corridor with a series of office doors. Malone stopped at one of them with a sign that read, Dr. O. Parker, Clinical Psychologist. "I'll wait for you here," the warden said. Foster knocked, and hearing an invitation to enter, opened the door. The psychologist's office was strikingly different from the rest of the prison. The warm light of the desk lamp, the bookshelves, the few potted plants, and the comfortable furniture created an almost home-like atmosphere. Behind the desk sat a woman of about 38, with short brown hair and attentive brown eyes. She lifted her head from her papers and looked questioningly at the newcomer. "Dr. Parker? Detective Michael Foster? Homicide. May I trouble you?" Olivia put down her pen and pointed to the chair across from her. "Of course, Detective. I assume you're here about Jason Warren?" "Yes." Foster sat down and pulled out a notebook. "I realize this is a heavy subject, but I need to ask a few questions. As far as I know, you worked with him on a regular basis?" Olivia nodded, her professional restraint wavering slightly. "Jason was a patient of mine for almost 2 years. We met once a week, sometimes more often if he requested additional sessions." "What impression did he make on you?" She thought for a moment, searching for words. Jason was a complex personality, very intelligent, charismatic, with excellent communication skills. He had a way of putting people at ease. At the same time, she paused, had a tendency to manipulate. It's typical of people with his history, a privileged childhood, constant pressure from successful parents, a desire to be the best at all costs. Did he show signs of depression or suicidal thoughts? Olivia frowned, her gaze becoming more focused. No, and that's what worries me most. Detective Jason hadn't shown any suicidal tendencies. On the contrary, at our last meeting, 3 days ago, he was animated, talking about his future plans, discussing how he would rebuild his career after he was released. He was less than a year away from possible parole. Foster eyed the psychologist carefully, noting her genuine surprise and concern. "Are you doubting the suicide theory?" "I can't categorically rule out that possibility," Olivia said cautiously. "In my practice, there have been cases when people hid their true intentions. But," she looked down at her notes, "given his psychological profile and our recent conversations, it seems unlikely." "Have you noticed any changes in his behavior recently?" Foster asked, making notes in his notebook. Olivia paused, as if weighing how much information she could reveal without violating confidentiality. There had indeed been a change in his behavior about a month ago. He had become more private about certain topics. He avoided direct answers more often. Sometimes he seemed distracted, absorbed in his own thoughts. But I attributed that to his upcoming parole board hearing. Did he have any conflicts with other inmates or staff? Not that there were conflicts. She hesitated. Jason was more of a peacemaker, but he did mention some tension with an inmate named Marcus Dunn. There was no real threat, though, as far as I could see. Foster nodded, writing down the name. "What about the staff? How was his relationship with the guards, the administration?" "Generally good. Jason had a way with people. The guards respected him for his correct demeanor. He had a more trusting relationship with some of the guards. Mr. Malone, for example." She nodded toward the door where the warden was waiting. "They talked often. Jason even gave him financial advice, for all I know." That piqued Foster's interest. He made another note. "Did you notice anything unusual in the last days before his death?" Olivia hesitated, rubbing her pen. "Yesterday, around noon, I saw Jason in the hallway. He seemed anxious, which was unusual for him. When I asked him if everything was okay, he said he needed to talk to me right away, but not right now. We arranged an unscheduled session for today." Her voice trembled slightly. "He said it was important, but not dangerous. He used those exact words. 'Don't worry, Dr. Parker, it's not dangerous for me.'" Foster watched the psychologist's reaction carefully. Her face expressed genuine concern and professional curiosity mixed with guilt, the typical reaction of a doctor who had lost a patient under mysterious circumstances. "Do you know what he wanted to talk about?" "No, he didn't specify. But, she faltered. "I got the impression it was about someone on the staff." Jason glanced over his shoulder when he mentioned it, as if checking to see if anyone could hear our conversation. This information made Foster wary. He closed his notebook and stood up. "Thank you for your help, Dr. Parker. I may have more questions." "Of course, Detective." Olivia nodded. "I want to understand what happened as much as you do. Jason deserves justice, whatever the truth is." When Foster left the office, Malone was still waiting in the hallway, his expression unruffled. But the detective noticed the warden discreetly wiping his sweaty palms on his pants. "Now show me Warren's cell," Foster said, watching Malone's reaction carefully. The warden nodded, his face calm, but there was a flicker of anxiety in his eyes. They headed back to the prison block, and Foster pondered the fact that Jason Warren's death seemed to be anything but suicide. Intuition, honed by years of investigation, told Michael that behind those walls, under the mask of discipline and order, were carefully hiding secrets that someone had deemed important enough to go on a killing spree. And perhaps Olivia Parker was closest to uncovering those secrets without realizing it. Jason Warren's cell was not what Foster expected. Instead of a standard prison cell, it was an almost neat living space. There were books on the shelf, books on finance and classic literature, and a few simple framed photographs on the wall. The bedding was rumpled, the only sign of disorder. Foster pulled on latex gloves and bent over the spot where the body had been discovered the night before. The metal bed frame from which Warren had supposedly hanged himself was about 2 meters high. "How did he fasten the sheet to the top?" Michael asked Malone, who was standing next to him. "There's no chair or other support." "Probably pulled himself up." "Warren kept in good physical shape," the warden replied, not looking the detective in the eye. Michael scrutinized the floor. No sign of a struggle or anything that could have served as a support. That was the first discrepancy. "Show me that makeshift noose," he asked. Malone pulled out an evidence bag. Inside was a twisted sheet tied with a professional knot. "You're saying he did this himself?" Foster raised an eyebrow. "This knot resembles a specialized nautical knot. Was Warren in the Navy?" "Not that I know of." Malone wrinkled his nose slightly. "Probably learned it on the internet. Prisoners share all sorts of information." "Prisoners don't have access to the internet," Foster pointed out. "And even if they did, why learn how to tie complicated knots?" That was the second discrepancy. Foster continued his inspection and noticed a small, dark spot on the floor under the bed. He bent down, shined his pocket flashlight on it. "Looks like blood," the detective muttered. "Pretty fresh. Must be from a hanging injury," Malone suggested quickly. "Self-hanging doesn't usually bleed," Foster objected. "And if it did, how did the drops get under the bed if the body was hanging over it?" That was the third discrepancy. Then Michael turned his attention to the nightstand where Warren's open notebook lay. The handwriting was neat, the contents dry and businesslike. Financial formulas, notes, drafts of letters. But on the last page, the inscription was in a completely different handwriting, jagged, hurried. "She must know that I—" The phrase broke off in mid-sentence. "Who could have written that?" Foster asked Malone. "I have no idea." The warden shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe Warren himself, in a state of passion before you understand." The detective flipped back a few more pages and found an entry dated yesterday afternoon. "Unscheduled session with Dr. P tomorrow. It's about time. Can't keep this to myself any longer." Michael snapped a picture of the pages on his phone and closed the notebook. This was the fourth discrepancy that convinced him that the suicide version was becoming less and less likely. In the interrogation room, Foster sat across from the young warden, Steve Harris, nervously tapping his fingers on the desk. "Tell me again what you saw last night," the detective asked, watching the young man's reaction carefully. "I made my usual evening rounds at 21:30, Harris began, looking over Foster's shoulder. "When I reached Warren's cell, I saw him hanging from a makeshift sheet noose. I radioed for a medic right away." "And who was the first responder on your call?" "The EMT, Ramirez. He pronounced him dead. Then came the shift supervisor, Malone." Foster made a note in his notebook. "How much time elapsed between your call and Malone's arrival?" Harris hesitated, his fingers continuing to beat out a nervous rhythm. "About 5 minutes, maybe 7. I can't say for sure." "That's odd," Foster remarked. "According to the duty log, Malone was supposed to be in Block B at the other end of the building. There's no way to get there in 5 minutes. Harris visibly tensed. "Maybe I got the timing wrong. It all happened so fast." "Or Malone was much closer than the log indicated," Foster finished for him. "Did you see him in Block C before the body was found?" The young warden turned pale. "No. I don't remember. I was concentrating on my rounds." Foster looked at his interlocutor carefully and changed tactics. "Steve, how long have you worked at Sonoran Hills?" 8 months, Harris replied, clearly relieved at the change of subject. "Do you like your job?" "Yes, I do. It has its challenges, but it's a good environment." "And how do you like working with Malone?" Harris was visibly tense. "It's fine. He's an experienced employee, taught me a lot." "Has he ever asked you to do anything, not quite according to protocol?" The young warden fidgeted in his chair. "I don't know what you mean. Like not marking in the logbook where he is at certain times? Or letting him spend more time than he should?" "No," Harris answered too quickly. "Never." Foster leaned back in his chair. "Steve, we checked the security footage. Malone entered cell block C at 20:05 when the logs say he should have been elsewhere, and he wasn't marked leaving the block until your call at 21:30. Harris looked like he wanted to fall through the ground. "Yeah, I didn't know. Now I only have one question for you. Are you lying out of fear of Malone or because you have something to hide?" Foster studied the medical report on Jason Warren's death while sitting in Dr. Parker's office. "The preliminary cause of death is asphyxiation," he read aloud. "But here's something interesting. A contusion to the back of the head sustained shortly before death. He could have hit himself while trying to hang himself," Olivia suggested, though there was doubt in her voice. "He could have," Foster agreed. "But combined with the other inconsistencies, it looks suspicious. Dr. Parker, what can you tell us about Warren and Malone's relationship?" Olivia hesitated, tapping her pen on the desk. "Officially, a standard warden-prisoner relationship, but Jason sometimes mentioned Malone in our conversations, said he gave him financial advice, helped him with investments. Is that allowed under the rules?" "No, of course not, but everyone knows these things happen. A lot of wardens go for minor infractions in exchange for peace of mind or information." Foster nodded. "Did you notice anything unusual in their interactions?" Olivia set aside her pen and looked at the detective with concern. "I was coming back from the archives last week, and I heard voices in the storage room, where no one usually is. One voice was definitely Warren's, which is odd since prisoners aren't allowed in that part of the building without special permission." She hesitated. "I thought the other voice was Malin's." "What were they talking about?" "I didn't eavesdrop." Olivia shook her head. "But as I walked by, I heard Jason say, 'I'm tired of this, Ray. It can't go on like this.'" Foster took note of that information and asked the next question. "You mentioned that Warren made an unscheduled appointment with you. What did he want to talk about?" "He didn't say specifically," Olivia replied, "but he seemed agitated and repeated that he couldn't keep it to himself anymore." In his small apartment in the suburbs, Ray Malone stood under the shower, trying to wash away the invisible traces of last night. The hot water burned his skin, but it couldn't take away the memories that haunted him every minute. 6 months ago, it had started so innocently. Jason Warren, an educated and charismatic inmate, had offered him financial advice. Ray, mired in debt after his divorce, agreed. The advice proved effective. His investment portfolio tripled in a short time. In gratitude, Malone began to provide Jason with small favors. Extra time in the library, extra newspapers, sometimes candy or cigarettes, forbidden by the rules. It seemed harmless. And then everything changed. What began as a mutually beneficial partnership turned into something more. A casual touch that lasted longer than necessary. A look that read more than there should be between warden and prisoner. Ray had never thought of himself as capable of such a relationship. But there was something about Jason that drew him like a magnet. Their meetings became regular. In the back rooms, the archives, sometimes even in Jason's cell late at night when the other wardens were distracted or looking the other way for a small reward. "I've never felt anything like this before," Jason said during one of these encounters. "With you, I can be myself." Ray believed him, though a part of his soul always doubted him. Jason was a manipulator. It was part of his nature, something that had gotten him into prison. But could it be that this time he was telling the truth? Everything had come crashing down a week ago when Dr. Parker had almost caught them in the archives. It had been a moment of awakening for Ray, a realization of how dangerous their game was. "We have to stop this," he told Jason that night. "If anyone finds out, I'll lose everything." But Jason didn't want to stop. "I'm tired of hiding," he objected. "Tired of pretending there's nothing between us." "There shouldn't be anything between us," Ray burst out. "You're the prisoner, I'm the warden. This was a mistake from the start." Jason's eyes darkened. "A mistake? So this whole thing was a mistake for you?" "Yes," Ray lied, though his heart was pounding with despair. "And it's time to end it." Jason stared at him for a long moment, then spoke words that made Ray's blood freeze in his veins. "I've booked a session with Dr. Parker, and I'm going to tell her everything." Malone turned off the water and stepped out of the shower, forcing himself back to the present. He wiped himself down, then walked over to the closet and pulled out a clean uniform. He looked at himself in the mirror, pale face, red eyes, signs of a sleepless night. Detective Foster was a smart man. He was already starting to ask the right questions. The question wasn't whether they would reveal the truth, but how soon it would happen. That night, the flame of a homemade candle made from saved wax and thread wavered in the jail cell. Jason Warren's face looked tired but determined. He was writing in his notebook, hastily jotting down the thoughts he was going to share in tomorrow's session with Dr. Parker. "I can't live a lie anymore," he wrote. "Even if it costs me a chance at parole, I have to tell the truth." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him flinch. Quickly blowing out the candle, Jason hid the notebook under the mattress and lay back on the bed, pretending to be asleep. Footsteps stopped outside his cell, the quiet sound of a key turning, the creak of the door opening. Jason opened his eyes and saw a silhouette in the darkness. A familiar silhouette. "What are you doing here?" he whispered. "It's not your shift." "We need to talk," came the quiet reply. "About what you're going to do tomorrow." Jason sat up on the bed. "My mind hasn't changed. I'm tired of lying, of having to hide. Do you realize where this is going to lead? For me? For you?" "I do. But I'm willing to take the risk." In the silence of the cell, only the heavy breathing of two people standing on the threshold of a decision that would change their fates forever could be heard. What happened next was not recorded by any surveillance camera. Only the dim light from the corridor for a moment showed two silhouettes out of the darkness, one taking a step forward, the other retreating back. The sound of the struggle was short and muffled. Then there was silence, broken only by heavy breathing and the sound of footsteps retreating down the corridor. And in the cell remained the body of a man whose secret had never been solved. Until now. The morning of the third day of the investigation greeted Michael Foster with the relentless Arizona sun. He had hardly slept, reviewing the evidence he had collected in a small hotel room a couple of kilometers from the Sonoran Hills. Scattered on the table, photos of the scene, witness statements, medical reports, and surveillance printouts were coming together to form a coherent picture. The detective sipped his coffee as he gazed at Ray Malone's face in one of the photos. Now he could clearly see what lay behind the professional mask of the warden: tension, fear, guilt, classic signs of a man hiding a secret. Foster reread the medical report on Jason Warren's death one more time. The entry, cervical vertebrae injury, probably inflicted prior to death, was underlined in red. The expert had confirmed his suspicions. The neck fracture had been caused by a blow or sudden movement by someone with specialized skills. Cross-references in Malone's personnel file pointed to his service in the Marine Corps, where he received training in hand-to-hand combat and tactical techniques for disarming the enemy. This explained both the Marine knot on the makeshift noose and the nature of the injuries to Warren's body. The most important evidence was the surveillance footage. A camera at the entrance to Cell Block C recorded Malone entering there at 20:05, when the duty log showed him to be in another sector. Another camera did not record him leaving until the body was discovered at 21:30. An hour and a half of undocumented presence in the victim's cell block. Foster gathered the paperwork into a folder, folded the printouts and photos. It was time to wrap this case up. At the administrative wing of Sonoran Hills, the detective was met by Thomas Shepard. The warden looked tense, though he tried to maintain his usual military bearing. "Detective Foster," he nodded. "What's the latest on the investigation?" "Substantial," Michael replied. "I've gathered enough evidence to press charges of murder." Shepard tensed visibly. "Against whom?" "I suppose you can guess." Foster watched his superior's reaction carefully. "I need to see Ray Malone. Is he on duty today?" "Yes, in the administrative block," Shepard answered after a short pause. "I can get him in the conference room for a chat." "That would be perfect." While the warden contacted Malone on the internal line, Foster laid out key evidence on the conference room table: crime scene photos, surveillance tape, medical reports. A few minutes later, the door opened and Ray Malone walked in. Seeing the documents spread out on the table, he froze for a moment, but quickly pulled himself together. "You wanted to see me, Detective?" "Yes, Mr. Malone. Sit down, please." The warden sat down across from Foster, keeping a stony expression on his face. But the detective, who had spent 20 years in interrogation rooms, could see the tiniest signs of nervousness, the faintest evaporation on his temples, the tense shoulders, the overly straight posture. "I've collected enough evidence to reconstruct the events of the evening of Jason Warren's death," Foster began, pointing to the photographs. "And the suicide theory doesn't hold up to scrutiny." Malone remained silent, neither denying nor confirming the detective's words. "You entered Block C at 29:05, Foster continued, pointing to the still image from the camera. "You were supposed to be in a different sector. Then you went to Warren's cell. What happened next?" "I was doing my usual rounds," Malone answered in a steady voice. "Nothing out of the ordinary." Foster shook his head and laid the next document on the table, the medical report. Warren's cervical vertebrae had been damaged. The nature of the injury indicated a blow or grab inflicted by a professional, someone trained in martial arts. As a former Marine, you have those skills. Malone flinched slightly, but remained silent. "And here's the best part." Foster laid Warren's notebook open on the table at the last entry. "She must know that I..." The phrase breaks off. "I think Warren was writing at the moment you appeared in the cell. She is Dr. Parker, isn't it? He was going to tell her about your relationship." A muscle trembled on Malone's face, the first clear sign that the facade was beginning to crumble. "There was no relationship," he said, but his voice was no longer as confident. "Dr. Parker saw you together in the archives," Foster parried. "Harris admitted that repeatedly did not notice your visits to Warren's cell at odd hours. Jason signed up for an unscheduled session with a psychologist the day after his death, and he wrote in his journal that he could no longer live a lie." Malone lowered his gaze, his hands, which had been resting on the table, clenched into fists, then relaxed, a gesture of internal struggle. "You had motive, you had opportunity," Foster continued. "You had access to the camera. You had the skills to inflict that kind of trauma, and you knew how to stage a suicide. The only question is, did you plan the murder beforehand, or did you do it in a fit of rage?" There was a long silence. The warden sat as still as a statue, his eyes fixed on the photographs. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked up at the detective. "I didn't plan to kill him," Malone said quietly. "I just wanted to talk, to convince him to keep quiet." Foster waited silently for him to continue. "It all started 6 months ago," Ray continued after a pause. Jason gave me financial advice. He helped me get out of debt after my divorce. We started talking, spending time together. And then he paused, searching for words. Things got complicated. You got into a relationship, Foster helped him. Malone nodded slowly. I never thought such a thing was possible. With a man, much less a prisoner, it went against everything I stand for. He rubbed his face with his hands. But with Jason, it was different. He was smart, understanding. Made me feel alive. What happened the night he died? Dr. Parker almost caught us in the archives the week before. I freaked out, decided to call it quits. But Jason didn't want to. He said he was tired of hiding, that he wanted to be honest. Malone shook his head. And when I refused, he threatened to tell the psychologist. Made an appointment with her the next day. And you went to his cell to stop him? Yes. I begged him to keep quiet, told him it would ruin my life. But he was adamant. Said if I didn't acknowledge our relationship, then it was all a lie on my part. Ray clenched his fists. We started arguing. He raised his voice. I was afraid someone would hear. I grabbed him by the shoulders to get him to keep his voice down. He lashed out and His voice shook. I pushed him harder than I meant to. He hit his head against the wall, then fell. I tried to bring him to his senses, but Malone covered his face with his hands. God, what I'd done. And the staged suicide? I panicked. I realized if there was a murder, they'd suspect me. I decided to make everyone think he'd killed himself. Ray looked up at the detective. I never meant to hurt him, I swear. Foster nodded, registering the confession. Mr. Malone, I am compelled to arrest you on suspicion of the murder of Jason Warren. You have the right to remain silent. The warden's office was as spotless as its owner, but today, Foster saw something new in Thomas Shepard, a nervousness hidden behind a mask of professionalism. Malone confessed, the detective said, sitting down uninvited in the chair opposite. He killed Warren when he refused to keep their relationship a secret, and then staged his suicide. Shepard nodded, his face impassive. It was a shame. He was a good employee. But you knew what was going on, didn't you? Foster watched his superior's reaction carefully. I don't know what you mean, Shepard replied, but his eyes showed concern. Malone told me about it. You called him into your office a week before the murder, warned him about the rumors, advised him to handle it quietly. Shepard remained silent, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. You also met with Warren twice that week, Foster continued, which is unusual for a warden. What did you discuss with him? Standard issues, Shepard said reluctantly. His behavior, his plans for parole. And nothing about his relationship with the warden? The warden paused, then sighed. Look, detective, in my position, you have to balance a lot of interests. The safety of the institution, the reputation, the budget. He paused. Yes, I've heard rumors of a personal relationship between Malone and Warren. I have warned both of them that this is unacceptable and could have repercussions for them. But you didn't take official action, Foster observed. You didn't transfer Malone to another unit. You didn't report him to a higher authority. Instead, you advised them to work it out on their own. I was hoping they'd be reasonable, Shepard defended himself. A scandal would have damaged the institution's reputation, and that would have affected funding, inmate programs. Foster shook his head. You put the reputation of the prison before the safety of the people, and as a result, one man is dead, and another man lost everything. I couldn't have foreseen that outcome, Shepard said, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. You couldn't? Or didn't want to? Foster stood up. I recommend you get a good lawyer, Mr. Shepard. Negligence resulting in a man's death is a serious charge. Olivia Parker sat in her office, poring over Jason's session notes. A knock on the door made her raise her head. Foster was standing on the doorstep. May I? He asked. I wanted to let you know that the investigation was complete. Come in. Olivia nodded. Did you find the killer? Yes. Malone confessed, the detective said, sitting down across from her. He killed Warren when he threatened to tell you about their relationship. Then he staged a suicide. Olivia lowered her gaze to the notes. I should have known. I saw the signs, but I didn't put them together. Don't blame yourself, Foster said softly. Malone and Warren had kept their relationship carefully hidden. But when Jason decided to be honest, it cost him his life, the psychologist finished. Yeah, tragic price to pay for the truth. What about Shepard? Olivia asked. I always thought he knew more than he was letting on. He did, Foster nodded. He warned them both, but he didn't take any official action. He feared for the reputation of the institution. He too would have to answer for his actions, or rather, inaction. They were silent, each immersed in his own thoughts about the cost of secrets and responsibility. You know what the saddest part is? Olivia finally said. They each believed in their own way that they were doing the right thing. Malone was protecting his reputation and his career. Warren wanted honesty. Shepard was trying to keep the institution out of scandal. And each of these right decisions led to tragedy. That's the complexity of human nature, Foster agreed. We can genuinely believe in the rightness of our actions but fail to see the consequences for others. A month after the investigation was completed, life at Sonoran Hills took a new turn. Thomas Shepard was suspended from his position while the negligence investigation was underway. His deputy was named interim chief and initiated a series of reforms to improve transparency among staff. Ray Malone was awaiting trial in the county jail. His confession and lack of premeditation gave hope for a reduced sentence, but the outlook was bleak, 5 to 15 years for manslaughter. Olivia Parker continued to work at Sonoran Hills, but her attitude toward her job had changed. She became more attentive to the smallest details, organized a support group for staff, and conducted training sessions to identify signs of inappropriate staff-inmate relationships. Michael Foster closed the case and went back to his day job, but the story of Jason Warren and Ray Malone would not let him go. In their tragedy, he saw a reflection of all those tangled cases where right and wrong, truth and lies were intertwined so closely that it was impossible to separate one from the other. The cell where Jason Warren had once lived was now occupied by a new prisoner who knew nothing of the drama that had played out within its walls. But sometimes at night, when the prison fell into silence, it seemed that the memory of what had happened was preserved within the walls themselves, reminding us that the most dangerous secrets are those we keep from ourselves. In official documents, the case was closed. Ray Malone, a former warden at Sonoran Hills Correctional Institution, was found guilty of murdering inmate Jason Warren. The motive was to cover up a non-statutory relationship. The sentence was 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 8. Justice prevailed, as much as possible in an imperfect world where the price of truth is sometimes too high, and payback for secrets catches not only the guilty, but also those who are close to them.